Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are starting with, well, a stack of source material that really confirms one of the biggest shifts in global industrial policy we've seen
Yeah.
in decades.
It really is. This is not a minor adjustment.
Not at all. And this isn't just about trade in the old sense. It's about a nation, the U.S., using its economic muscle to fundamentally re-engineer the geography of, the most critical technology on the planet. We're going to be diving deep into this massive trade and investment agreement. It was just signed this Thursday, January 15th, 2026, between the United States and Taiwan.
And when we talk about this deal, it's so important for you to understand we are not talking about simple duties on clothing or, steel.
No. We are talking about advanced semiconductors, the tiny, tiny components that are quite literally the lifeblood of everything. I mean, from your smartphone all the way up to America's most advanced defense systems.
The absolute bedrock of the modern economy.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward, but it's meticulous. We need to unpack the specific terms of this agreement. And we're really concentrating on the two sides of this negotiation.
The dual nature of it.
Exactly. On one side, you have the immediate carrot, a tangible, measurable tariff reduction from the U.S. But on the other side, there's this monumental strategic commitment, a massive reshoring pledge from Taiwan's biggest technology giants.
It's huge.
So we're going to analyze the specific dollar figures, understand the explicit policy goal of bringing 40% of Taiwan's supply chain to American soil, and really try to grasp what this $500 billion mobilization means for everything. Global supply chains, costs, national security.
And you're absolutely right to frame this as a convergence point, because for years, U.S. policy has been trying to run on these two parallel tracks.
Right.
One track is that classic trade negotiation, trying to resolve these huge trade imbalances, often using tariffs as the main tool, the stick. The second, and I think you'd agree, far more urgent track is this critical national security imperative. And that really hit a fever pitch after all the recent global supply disruptions. It created this demand, this need to bring essential semiconductor manufacturing capacity back home.
Back to the continent, yeah.
Exactly. So this agreement, signed this week, is basically the ultimate policy handshake. It links those two streams. It's exchanging tariff relief, which is a major economic win for Taiwan, for concrete, guaranteed, and just massive domestic U.S. investment.
And when you pull all the data from the sources we've gathered, the headline figures are they're truly staggering. The lowering of U.S. tariffs is important, sure.
It's the lubricant for the deal.
It is. It serves as the incentive. But the real story, the strategic goal, is the hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, we're talking $500 billion when you count the guarantees, all pledged by Taiwanese tech companies to build out a new industrial ecosystem right here in America.
A whole ecosystem, not just one factory.
Right. This is not some, marginal policy tweak. This is a strategic attempt to redraw the industrial map of high-tech manufacturing.
And it really is the pinnacle of a strategic exchange. The U.S. offers Taiwan a necessary reduction in these duties that were creating friction and, frankly, a lot of cost for their exports. And in return, Taiwan essentially commits to rooting a significant, irreplaceable part of its most advanced production capacity on U.S. soil.
So it's not a slow, gradual change thereafter.
No, not at all. It's a mechanism designed for maximum leverage, for a rapid structural shift in where this technology is built. For both sides, honestly, the immediate economic benefit of that tariff drop is secondary to the long-term security implications of the reshoring.
Okay, so let's break this down. Let's start with the tariff shift, the immediate tangible incentive, the adjustment announced by the U.S. Commerce Department. What exactly is the magnitude of this tariff reduction?
So the Commerce Department confirmed a very specific, measurable reduction. The U.S. has officially committed to lowering the tariffs on a whole range of Taiwanese goods to a new cap rate of 15%.
15. So 1 to 5%.
Yes. That 15% rate is now the ceiling under this new agreement, and that gives importers immediate cost predictability.
And that 15% rate is really significant because it is a clear drop from what was already in place. The source materials confirmed the existing rate was, what, 20%?
That's right. The existing rate, which they called a reciprocal rate, was 20%. And that 5-point drop, I mean, it might sound small when we're talking about these massive economic figures, but for high-volume trade,
it's enormous.
It represents an instant competitive advantage and cost saving for every single container ship arriving from Taiwan that's carrying these covered goods.
And you just use that keyword reciprocal. To really get this, you have to understand the context of that previous 20% duty. The Commerce Department's own language described it that way, so we have to peel that back. What does reciprocal actually mean here?
That is the key policy term. Let's elaborate on it because it is vital. When the U.S. applies a reciprocal duty, it's not just your standard import tax.
It's sending a message.
It's absolutely sending a message. It means that duty was imposed specifically as a tool, a correctional measure. It was intended to address what the U.S. saw as a major trade deficit, or maybe to counteract trade practices in Taiwan that the U.S. government felt were unfair.
So it was punitive. It was designed to exert leverage.
That is the crux of it. The 20% wasn't just about raising revenue, it was a stick. It signaled U.S. displeasure with the trade imbalance, and it placed a heavy economic toll on Taiwanese exporters.
And I bet U.S. importers weren't too happy either.
No, not at all. In fact, many U.S. importers of Taiwanese goods had been lobbying the Commerce Department very loudly, arguing that these reciprocal duties were just raising costs for American businesses and ultimately for American consumers.
So the reduction to 15% isn't some act of goodwill.
No, it is a signal that the U.S. believes it has gotten a fair exchange. They're removing a portion of that leverage, that 5 percentage point reduction in direct return for these massive investment pledges that are going to fundamentally realign the industrial landscape.
So the U.S. is basically saying, okay, you're committing to build here, so we don't need to punish you as much at the border.
Precisely. It's the U.S. saying, we recognize your commitment to domestic investment, and therefore the need for this specific economically burdensome reciprocal duty has diminished, at least partially. The tariff relief is the guaranteed dividend Taiwan gets for making this huge long-term investment.
It makes compliance economically feasible for them.
It makes it significantly more palatable. And we also have to note, this tariff shift isn't just about, one basket of goods. The Commerce Department was careful to detail the specific categories that will benefit from this 15% rate cap.
Which indicates the negotiations were pretty wide-ranging.
Very. It covered a lot of foundational materials.
So which sectors were specifically named? Because obviously semiconductors are the strategic core here, but trade is so much bigger than that.
That's right. And beyond the high-tech stuff, the sources explicitly mention that the 15% cap will apply to Taiwanese auto parts.
Which is huge for the U.S. auto manufacturing base.
Crucial, and also, significantly, to timber, lumber, and wood products.
Okay, that's interesting. So construction materials, too.
Exactly. This inclusion really shows the breadth of the economic relationship. While semiconductors dominate the headlines, the deal had to be comprehensive enough to provide relief and, political cover across multiple sectors, including those foundational to American housing and construction.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're going to reshore heavy manufacturing, you need cheaper, predictable sources for all the inputs and components. And a lot of those come from partners like Taiwan.
Absolutely. It just goes to show you how complex these trade negotiations really are. You're balancing these high-tech strategic goals with the practical realities of everyday material sourcing. It's a very delicate dance.
And speaking of effort, the source documents confirm this wasn't some quick deal hammered out over a weekend. This whole thing was the culmination of months of negotiations.
Oh, absolutely. When you consider the complexity balancing specific tariff cuts on everything from lumber to auto parts against hundreds of billions of dollars in strategic investment pledges, that negotiation period must have been incredibly intense.
The complexity had to be immense.
Immense, and not least because the Commerce Department had to satisfy both U.S. domestic industrial demands, getting production home, and Taiwan's need for continued market access. That 20% tariff was the perfect lever. It created this constant economic drag that made the very expensive decision to reshore look, strategically, like the cheaper option in the long run.
So the reduction to 15% is just the first payout.
It's the first payout in a very long-term compliance strategy.
Okay, so let's get to the really interesting part. We move from these trade adjustments to, fundamental industrial strategy. If the tariff relief was the incentive, the sheer scale of the Taiwanese financial commitments is the prize the U.S. was after.
It really is. When you look at these figures, you realize this moves beyond simple economic policy.
Yeah.
This is nation-scale industrial planning.
The scale is staggering, and it's clearly targeted. These are financial commitments designed specifically to help the U.S. regain control over the advanced semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem.
The money is flowing directly toward building capability here.
So let's dissect the two major investment pillars. It's not just a single pot of money. It's two distinct types of capital mobilization that get us to that $500 billion number. What's the first commitment? The direct capital.
Pillar one is the cash on the barrelhead, so to speak. Taiwanese chip and tech businesses have officially committed to making new direct investments totaling at least $250 billion in the United States.
An order of $1 trillion.
Quarter of a trillion. And this is hard capital committed by the companies themselves. It's going toward building facilities, buying specialized equipment, and creating high-wage jobs.
And it's so important to be specific about the focus of this money. This isn't just speculative investment, right? It's aimed at the most valuable, most critical parts of the tech stack.
Absolutely. The sources are very clear. This investment is earmarked for building and expanding capacity for advanced semiconductors and for artificial intelligence, or AI.
And we need to define advanced semiconductors for you listening. We're talking about the most cutting-edge microchips.
The bleeding edge. Often defined by their small node sizes, so think 3 nanometer or 2 nanometer fabrication. These are the chips that power the next generation of everything: defense hardware, cloud infrastructure, and, critically, the AI accelerators that define modern computing.
So the U.S. wants the keys to the future.
And those keys are manufactured on these advanced nodes. That's what this is about.
Okay, so that $250 billion in direct investment is immense on its own. But Pillar 2 is what really amplifies the firepower and unlocks the entire supply chain. What's the second piece? The guaranteed financing.
Pillar 2 is the crucial part that mobilizes the whole ecosystem. Taiwan has committed to providing credit guarantees of at least $250 billion to facilitate additional investment, and this is focused specifically on the rest of the American semiconductor supply chain.
Okay, so let's clarify that for everyone. What's the real difference between direct investment and a credit guarantee? And why is that guarantee so essential to making this whole reshoring thing work?
The difference is profound. The direct investment is the equitier. The big players, the big chip fabricators like TSMC are putting in themselves. The credit guarantees, though, are basically state-backed financial security measures.
So it's like a safety net for lenders.
It's exactly that. Think about it this way. For a company like TSMC to move to Arizona, they need their whole supply chain to come with them. The smaller Taiwanese firms that produce the specialized chemicals, the high-precision tools, the packaging materials, they need massive loans to build their own new U.S. facilities.
And a U.S. bank might see that as pretty risky.
Extremely risky. A U.S. bank might look at one of these smaller niche suppliers and say, you want to relocate across the ocean. That's a huge risk. The $250 billion in credit guarantees changes that whole equation. Taiwan is stepping in and essentially telling the banks, if this smaller supplier defaults on the loan they took to build their U.S. factory, we, the Taiwanese government or a state-backed entity, will guarantee the repayment.
Which de-risks it for the banks.
It dramatically reduces the risk for U.S. and international lenders. It makes it significantly easier and cheaper for that entire supply chain to get the capital they need to relocate. It's the accelerator for the entire ecosystem.
So you combine the $250 billion in direct capital with the $250 billion in guarantees, and you're looking at a total mobilization effort of at least $500 billion.
$500 billion.
And it's all aimed explicitly at shifting the center of gravity for the world's most critical technology sector. This isn't just about incentivizing one factory. It's about rebuilding an entire industrial base from the ground up.
It is exactly that. It's a comprehensive mechanism designed to create a sticky, self-sustaining, high-tech ecosystem here in the U.S. The objective is clear: mobilize capital, expertise, and infrastructure all at once.
And the U.S. Commerce Department left zero room for interpretation about what they want out of this. They stated the deal will drive a massive reshoring of America's semiconductor sector. But what's the actual target? Secretary Lutnick gave us a specific, measurable goal.
He did, and it is probably the most revealing number in the entire agreement. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick specified in his CNBC interview that the policy's objective is to bring 40% of Taiwan's entire supply chain and production domestically into America.
40%, wow. That's nearly half of Taiwan's industrial crown jewel, which, that raises a massive question of feasibility. Is that even logistically possible? Where does the U.S. find the specialized labor, the infrastructure, and critically, the energy and water for a move like that, especially in a place like Arizona?
That is the critical challenge that the deal itself doesn't solve. It only funds. The 40% goal implies a workforce of tens of thousands of highly skilled engineers, technicians, construction workers. It demands gargantuan amounts of highly purified water and reliable, cheap energy.
So the deal kicks the can down the road on those problems.
Well, it shifts the complexity. While the $500 billion mobilizes the capital, the U.S. states and local governments now face this enormous logistical hurdle of supplying the land, water, and power. The policy effectively shifts the burden of infrastructure readiness onto the U.S. side. It's a bet that the national security imperative is strong enough to force the necessary internal investments in utilities and labor training.
It sounds like the U.S. is transferring the risk of concentrated supply, the geopolitical risk, but substituting it with massive infrastructure and environmental risk right here at home.
That is the trade-off. But from a national security perspective, it's a different kind of risk. They are exchanging a geopolitical risk, Taiwan Strait tension, a potential blockade, for a domestic risk that is, at least in theory, manageable. It's a logistical and environmental risk, not an existential one.
And Secretary Lutnick made it clear that while 40% is the immediate target with Taiwan, the long-term ambition is much broader than that.
He was very direct about the ultimate policy objective. He stated the U.S. wants to become self-sufficient in the capacity of building semiconductors by bringing production all over.
All over.
All over, which suggests that this 40% from Taiwan is just the single most crucial and largest first step. The overall goal is to aggregate capacity from all kinds of sources, domestic startups, other allies, and these Taiwanese giants, until the U.S. can domestically produce everything it needs.
Effectively insulating itself from future global supply shocks.
And from the volatility of geopolitical hotspots. Yes. This relentless drive for self-sufficiency, it just underscores a fundamental shift in how the U.S. views globalization, at least in critical sectors.
The era of assuming that efficiency and cost savings outweigh geopolitical risk is, well, for the chip sector at least, it's officially over.
Absolutely. The U.S. is willing to pay a massive premium through tariff adjustments and hundreds of billions in incentives and infrastructure spending to de-risk its economic future and its military capabilities. This is not a market decision. This is a state-driven industrial imperative.
Okay, let's pivot now to the key corporate player here. Because when you talk about Taiwanese semiconductors and reshoring, the conversation really just centers on one company, TSMC.
The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And TSMC is not just a big company, it is a global choke point.
That's a great way to put it.
It is the world's biggest contract maker of microchips. To give you some context, TSMC is where the most advanced processing technology resides. They are the ones fabricating the chips used by behemoths like Apple for their iPhones, and critically, the advanced AI accelerators produced by NVIDIA.
So if TSMC stops making the latest chips,
the entire global technology roadmap grinds to a halt. It's that simple.
So if the U.S. goal is to secure its supply chain, it means securing not just the company's goodwill, but its physical presence on American soil.
Right.
And the sources confirm that the Commerce Secretary gave some concrete evidence that this is already moving forward in Arizona.
Yes, the evidence is concrete and geographical. Secretary Lutnick confirmed in that CNBC interview that TSMC has already taken essential, tangible steps toward this massive expansion that's tied to the deal. He cited the fact that TSMC has bought hundreds of acres adjacent to their property in Arizona.
So they're buying up the land.
They're buying up the land. Now, obviously, regulatory and board approvals are still needed for the full build-out, but the land acquisition shows that the strategic commitment is physically being executed. It shows the prep work is well underway for what's going to be a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar construction project.
So that brings us to Taiwan's side of this. Why are they agreeing to this monumental, highly concentrated shift of their industrial base? They get the tariff relief, sure, but what's President Lai Ching-te's geopolitical calculus here? Why give up the efficiency of keeping everything at home?
Taiwan's motivation is fundamentally about security insurance, but it's masquerading as economic policy. The source material notes that President Lai Ching-te had previously made a proactive pledge to boost investments in the United States and, at the same time, increase defense spending.
So this deal is just making good on that pledge.
It is the operationalization of that pledge. By heavily investing in the U.S., Taiwan is making its own technological fate inseparable from U.S. domestic economic health. They are proactively lowering those U.S. duties and avoiding future tariffs on their critical chip exports by establishing themselves as essential domestic manufacturers in America.
So the investment itself functions as a kind of strategic down payment on future U.S. security commitments.
I think that's a perfect way to describe it.
By making themselves indispensable to America's own defense and technology production, they're solidifying that strategic bond. They're reducing any incentive the U.S. might have to stay neutral in a future conflict.
Exactly. It reinforces the geopolitical reality that an economic partnership based on essential technology is the strongest form of security partnership. Taiwan is demonstrating its reliability and its utility as a partner by addressing America's core security anxiety, which is supply chain vulnerability.
Yeah.
This is a massive, tangible move to ensure continued, intense U.S. support.
Let's just take a moment and step back to reemphasize the role of semiconductors in all this.
Yeah.
Why are they the focal point of a $500 billion agreement?
Well, the simple answer is that chips are the lifeblood of the global economy. And, increasingly, they're the core components of military power. Modern warfare, advanced infrastructure, global financial markets, it all relies on cutting-edge chips.
And Taiwan holds the keys.
Taiwan, as the powerhouse of advanced fabrication, holds the technological key to nearly every modern system. So by demanding 40% of that production be moved here, the U.S. is hedging against any military action, any blockade, or even a natural disaster that could impact the Taiwan Strait. This deal is the ultimate de-risking strategy against geographic concentration.
This policy push also needs to be seen against a backdrop of, well, historical tension and industrial anxiety in the U.S. This isn't a brand new idea, this reshoring effort. It's the culmination of years of political pressure.
That's right. We have to acknowledge the political origin of these trade tensions. Former President Trump, for example, previously and very aggressively accused Taiwan of stealing the U.S. chip industry.
Right, I remember that.
And that sentiment reflected a deep-seated feeling within U.S. policy circles that globalization had hollowed out American manufacturing, especially in these critical high-tech areas. So that political desire to regain the industrial base, to have critical technology made on American soil, that's the ultimate political force driving the current Commerce Department's actions. This deal is the transactional answer to a multi-administration political demand.
So the deal isn't just about economic numbers. It's about resolving this deep-seated political grievance about U.S. industrial decline by, well, forcing a relocation.
It is attempting to solve that grievance by making the relocation economically irresistible for the Taiwanese firms. And the incentive structure that's built into this deal goes far beyond just that immediate 5% tariff drop.
Okay.
There's a specific long-term reward mechanism for companies that comply with this reshoring mandate.
So what is that specific policy incentive? What's the long-term promise being made to these Taiwanese firms for building new U.S. chip operations?
The Commerce Department's announcement was very clear and very strategic about this. Taiwanese firms that build new U.S. chip operations will be treated more favorably when it comes to future duties on semiconductors.
Ah, okay, so it's about the future.
It's all about the future. And this is arguably the most valuable part of the deal for a company like TSMC and its partners, maybe even more valuable than the initial 5% tariff drop.
Why is that so important?
Because once these companies commit billions to building foundries in Arizona or wherever, they need long-term stability for the rest of their operations, the 60% of their production that will still be in Taiwan. The promise of favorable future duties is basically a guarantee that the U.S. won't suddenly slap them with punitive tariffs, which protects their global business model.
So it creates stability and predictability.
In exchange for the immense effort of relocation, it locks in their compliance through a future economic advantage.
That is a masterclass in strategic negotiation.
Yes.
You use the immediate carrot, the 15% cap, and then this long-term stability carrot of favorable future duties to achieve the ultimate goal, the $500 billion mobilization and the 40% domestic production target.
It creates a symbiotic relationship. By investing heavily here, they gain protection against future trade wars and unpredictable duty swings on their remaining exports. The cost of not participating becomes far, far higher than the cost of establishing a massive U.S. presence.
Okay, let's try to synthesize the economic significance of all this. We talked about the original 20% tariff being a reciprocal rate that was meant to address a massive trade imbalance.
Yep.
Let's use the actual trade data to really illustrate the economic reality that was the foundation for these tariffs.
The foundation is indeed a very large and very strategic trade surplus. The sources confirm that Taiwan's trade surplus in goods with the U.S. was approximately $74 billion in 2024.
$74 billion.
$74 billion. That substantial figure provided the political leverage for the U.S. to implement and maintain those high reciprocal tariffs that were aimed at forcing some kind of economic correction.
And $74 billion is a big number, but the context is everything. What's the composition of that trade surplus? Is it diversified, or is it really concentrated in this strategic sector we've been talking about?
Oh, it is heavily, almost overwhelmingly concentrated in high-tech. Our analysis confirms that more than half of Taiwan's exports to the U.S. are information and communications technology products, ICT products. including semiconductors.
There it is.
There it is. And this confirms why that trade deficit generated such urgency in Washington. It wasn't just a deficit of goods, it was a deficit of capability. The surplus represented U.S. reliance on offshore production for the very products that define global technological leadership.
So this policy is surgically targeted. The U.S. is reducing the economic pain, the tariff, only in exchange for a resolution of the supply chain risk within the ICT sector, which is the root cause of the trade imbalance in the first place.
It perfectly links the economic ledger to the geopolitical ledger. The U.S. reduces the trade deficit by, in theory, importing fewer chips and creating domestic manufacturing jobs, while at the same time increasing its national security.
Let's talk about the cost factor, which is crucial for you listening at home. Manufacturing advanced chips in the U.S. is just inherently more expensive than in Taiwan. Primarily due to higher labor, land, energy, and regulatory costs. If the goal is 40% reshoring, won't this just lead to more expensive semiconductors for U.S. consumers and tech companies? Could it potentially negate the benefit of the tariff reduction?
That is the essential economic trade-off. And yes, the cost of manufacturing advanced nodes in the U.S. is projected to be substantially higher, maybe 20 to 40% more expensive than in Taiwan.
That's a huge difference.
It's a huge premium. So this deal, while it offers immediate tariff relief with that 5% drop, is fundamentally committing the U.S. economy to higher long-term manufacturing costs for that 40% of its chip supply.
So how do they justify that?
Well, the Commerce Department and the Pentagon view this premium as an acceptable price for security resilience. They are betting that the certainty of supply, the reduced geopolitical risk, and the ability to control intellectual property domestically outweigh the increased manufacturing cost.
And for military applications, cost is secondary anyway.
Exactly. For military applications where cost is secondary to reliability and security, this is a non-negotiable requirement. For consumers, the price difference might be absorbed by the big tech companies, or it might result in marginally higher prices for your next phone or computer. But the U.S. government has decided that dependence is the greater cost.
So the U.S. is essentially implementing a strategic subsidy through policy. It's accepting that its domestic chips will be more expensive, but ensuring they are available and secure.
That's the core conclusion, yes. The U.S. is using market mechanisms, tariffs, and incentives to force a strategic economic outcome that the market, left to its own devices, would never choose.
Let's turn to the strategic importance of that 40% goal, the so-called self-sufficiency threshold. If the U.S. actually does this, if it achieves 40% of Taiwan's supply chain domestically, how dramatically does that affect U.S. resilience against geopolitical instability?
Achieving 40% is a fundamental game changer, but its impact really depends on the nature of the crisis you're imagining.
Okay.
If we imagine a scenario involving, say, a blockade or a massive natural disaster that hits Taiwan, that 40% domestic capacity becomes a strategic reserve. It provides enough supply to cover core defense needs, essential infrastructure like power grids and communication, and critical AI development for a sustainable period.
So it ensures national continuity?
It ensures national continuity and defense readiness, even if 100% of the offshore capacity is temporarily disabled. But, and this is big, but 40% does not eliminate risk.
Right, there's still 60% out there.
Exactly. It means the U.S. is still reliant on the stability of the Taiwan Strait for the remaining 60% of its total supply, especially for commercial-grade products and consumer electronics. So the U.S. is moving from a position of absolute reliance to one of strategic partial autonomy.
But that partial autonomy is enough to change the diplomatic and military calculus in Washington dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. It changes the U.S.'s posture. It gives them leverage and breathing room. It transforms reliance into partnership. It provides optionality. It shifts the U.S. from being a passive consumer of a global supply chain to an active controller of a significant portion of its own critical supply.
And that 40% number isn't random.
No. That 40% is likely viewed by strategists as the minimum critical mass required to sustain the U.S. economy and military during a major unforeseen disruption.
And if we look at the logistics of this, who's actually monitoring the implementation of that $250 billion in credit guarantees? That's a huge potential liability.
The implementation will be highly complex. It will involve multiple government agencies, financial institutions, probably overseen by a joint U.S.-Taiwan task force that's tied directly to the Commerce Department and maybe the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. And the key is making sure the money goes to the right places. That's the crucial oversight, ensuring that the guaranteed capital actually goes toward building out the necessary supply chain components, the specialized chemical plants, the tooling companies, the precision packaging firms, not just toward the big TSMC fabs. The 40% goal relies on the whole ecosystem being relocated, not just the flagship manufacturer.
So this deal, when you boil it all down, is about reducing systemic vulnerability by using powerful economic leverage. It's arguably the most dramatic demonstration of trade policy being used as a tool of national security in this, post-globalization era.
And it sets a powerful precedent. It signals to all of our trading partners that deep market access in the U.S. going forward will increasingly be contingent upon verifiable commitments to bolster America's domestic strategic capacity.
Okay, this has been an incredibly detailed look at a trade and investment agreement that really promises to fundamentally reshape the technology sector over the next decade. Let's quickly summarize the key takeaways for you, the learner, to carry forward.
Good idea.
First, the trade relief. Tariffs on many key Taiwanese goods, including foundational materials like auto parts and lumber, are dropping from 20% down to a new capped rate of 15%. That's the immediate economic incentive.
Right.
Second, the monumental financial commitment. The total capital mobilization aimed at U.S. reshoring tops $500 billion. That's made up of $250 billion in direct investment by Taiwanese firms and another $250 billion in credit guarantees provided by Taiwan to accelerate the relocation of the entire supply chain.
Into places like Arizona.
Exactly. And finally, the strategic objective. The explicit, measurable goal is to bring 40% domestic control of the entire Taiwanese semiconductor supply chain into the U.S., moving toward a state of strategic self-sufficiency in this critical technology, even if it comes at a higher manufacturing cost.
Which brings us to the final provocative thought for you to consider as you digest this enormous strategic move. If this deal successfully moves 40% of Taiwan's advanced supply chain to the U.S., the fundamental question for American foreign policy is this. What does that 40% threshold do to the U.S. commitment to regional security? Does the reduced reliance on the remaining 60%, which remember still relies on stability in the Taiwan Strait, mean that the U.S. can afford to reduce the massive defense spending and intense diplomatic efforts currently focused on that region now that it's secured its core technological needs? Or conversely, does securing that 40% actually strengthen the strategic bonds so much that the U.S. is now more compelled to protect the region to ensure the security of its $500 billion investment?
It's the ultimate balancing act. Is it an investment strategy or is it a deep anchoring strategy? Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Always a pleasure.